Hello, everyone. This is the Eddie Network Podcast, and I'm your host, Ed Breniger. My guest today is Paul Grier, a fellow I've known for a long time. And we knew each other because we were both consulting with churches, particularly within the Presbyterian world. And Paul has just retired, and I'm happy for him. And I want to find out what he's going to do this afternoon. He's free. He's free this afternoon. So welcome, Paul. Tell us a little bit about who you are, what you've done, and how did you end up doing this stuff with the church?
Oh my gosh. Just a weird set of circumstances. I'm Paul, recently retired from the Presbyterian Foundation, the largest Christian denominational foundation in North America. My undergraduate degree is in business and finance. My graduate degree is in health administration. And I worked for several different multi-hospital systems, met my wife at one of those. We've now been married for 34 years, have 2 adult children and 1 grandchild who's today's Thursday, 3 weeks old today. No, 4 weeks old today. 4 weeks. Wow. He's getting big and looks just like me. So concluding my service to one health system, I thought I wanted to do something a little bit different. I've long been interested in the intersection of faith and money, faith and finances. And many of us have a bit of a jaded view about how the church looks at money, talks about money, deploys money. And so what I thought would be, maybe a little bit of an early midlife crisis would be a couple of years. I made a 3-year commitment, and then I just kept going and kept going. And then 22 years later, I've just retired 4 days ago. The thing that's interesting is whether you're in the healthcare business or whether you're in traditional Protestant expression, money is this really, really touchy subject. And the other thing that I was quite surprised to discover is that the people who make the decisions, whether they are medical professionals or whether they are clergy or church denominational leaders, don't seem to be the same people who are paying the bills for those decisions. And so there is the art of persuasion, the art of informing as to, my family practitioner told me a couple of months ago, you probably ought to get such and such. And insurance doesn't pay for it. But it's only $100, and it's probably a pretty good idea. Okay, that's not a hard decision. But when you're looking at significant amounts of money or any type of significant amount of commitment of financial resources, there's the inevitable pushback. A lot of people in the United States don't like the way the healthcare system works. In 2015, when Bernie Sanders was running for president, Bernie and I don't agree on many things, but we were stuck in the same airport waiting for a long delayed flight. And we ended up having a very, very interesting conversation. I came away with a much higher level of respect for Bernie Sanders. I still don't agree with him on a lot of things. And to be fair, he doesn't agree with me either. But we had this really rich conversation about where he was coming from and where I was coming from. And I was coming from it from a pretty basic math perspective. The Affordable Care Act, often called Obamacare, was still pretty new then. And the senator made the mistake of asking what I thought, and I told him. And it was based on math. Senator Sanders bases a lot of his opinions based on a social justice approach. Neither one of those is right, neither one of those is wrong, or they're both right and they're both wrong, but we were coming at this from really, really different perspectives. And when hours and hours later, we were finally able to board, his wife was very, very charming, said some nice things. And the senator said, I'm really glad we had a chance to talk because I think both of us might have learned something. And he said, and you've got experience in the healthcare industry that I don't have. And then I told him what I did then. And he said, wow, you don't go after the easy points of the marketplace. So whether it's in the church or whether it's in the healthcare business, money drives everything. But values, ethics, moral imperatives also drive things. And that constant tension is what we read about in the newspapers every day. So most people think that I just did this total 180 career-wise. Actually, the jobs were very, very similar. And for the last 7 or 8 years at the foundation, most of what I did was working with faith communities for whom the landscape has changed. So Ed, you and I were just talking about growth areas in the United States. That's not where I was spending most of my time. I was spending most of my time in the Northeast or the upper Midwest, where the financial pressures on faith communities has been much, much more pronounced than in those parts of the country that are growing. Their time will come in time. But having the conversations about what can we afford, how do we prioritize, just like families sitting around the kitchen table have to prioritize, well, that lab test costs $100 and the insurance doesn't pay for it. How do we prioritize that?
Yeah.
For some of us, that's not a complicated discussion. For others, that's the difference between groceries for the week and not. And we can't take that lightly.
One of the things that I identified early on when I started consulting, which was 30 years ago, was the inability of organizational leaders to decide how they were going to change their organization.
Right.
And what I saw was they saw the need. They would hire me to come in and identify, help them clarify what the problem is, put a strategy together to solve it. And one of the guys I was working with, he brought me in to help him on some of his fundraising, deals. But what I found was it was sufficient for them to know where their problems were, but they weren't going to do anything about it. Because I think what the mindset was, well, we'll address this when we really have to, and we're going to put this off. And so, and in some of these churches, there was one church that I worked with that in the space of about 20 years had gone from 1,200 members down to 200 members. And the question is, well, what are we going to do? And the reality was they were still living off the seed corn of the previous pastor who had retired 20 years before. And everything they did was based on, well, that's the way Dr. Joe did it. And so if Dr. Joe did it that way, then that's the way we're going to do it. And I had that conversation with the staff and the session. I said, well, why are you doing this? And they said, well, this way, Doctor, do all your new members understand why you do this? And they said, no. He says, well, you realize you're alienating your new members because you have not told them why you do these things that they see as illogical and irrational and without making any sense. They said, well, that's their problem. Of course. But what I find fascinating is this propensity in the human mind or the human person and in the social environment of these human beings to deny reality and to avoid change because they don't know what the outcome of on the other side of the change will be.
And two things immediately come to mind. And one is the acknowledgement of the context, the acknowledgement of the reality. And the second thing is some of the more basic elements of leadership. Two quick illustrations come to mind. I was working with a church that was having money paying off its mortgage debt. Church had been around for 100 and some odd years. Mortgage was 20 some odd years old. It was a couple $1 million. They were really tired of making those mortgage payments. Well, as it turns out, it had been a capital campaign. I think it had been 21 years earlier. And the pastor was telling me that he was just having a lot of trouble motivating members to give to satisfy the debt. Well, let's face it, debt service is the least, every fundraiser will tell you, that's the hardest money to raise because there's nothing sexy about debt service. And so I asked him a question. I said, okay, so of the X number of members you have, how many of them were around 22 years ago? Well, he didn't know. And I said, okay, here's the homework before we talk again. Figure out what percentage of the church membership was around 22 years ago. And he was a little unclear as to why I was asking the question. So we talked again a week later, and it was less than 20% of the church membership had been there 20 years before. And he said, I'm not sure I understand why this matters. And I said, well, here's the problem. Your reality is you're dealing with a group of people who have always taken your beautiful new facilities for granted. Because when they joined you, when they became part of your community, these facilities were already here. Now, you've got 18 or 22% of your folks who remembered the leaks, who remembered, the absence of an elevator. And they still appreciate the fact that they've got something new and exciting and different, even if it is 20 years old.
Yeah.
And then that leads to the leadership point of how do we communicate with folks? How do we inspire folks? I hate it when people say, oh, we need to educate whatever group it is. No, you're dealing with intelligent people. How do you inspire people to care enough about something, to share some of their resources, in this case, on a building that they've always taken for granted? And so there was a shift in the way they thought. There was a shift in the way they talked, and they were able to get that mortgage satisfied within 12, 16 months. But on the other hand, there's another congregation that I worked with that was doing amazing inner city ministry, just phenomenal inner city ministry. And yet, if you sat down with the group of church leaders, the only thing you heard was how they used to be X thousand members, and now they were less than 100. They had a huge physical plant. There was no question. They had some very real economic challenges. But the pastor, oh my gosh, she was terrific. The pastor said once, just almost as a throwaway, she said something about the hinges on the front door and how the hinges on the front door had worn out and had to be replaced. And she kept talking. I was like, whoa, back up. Say that again. And she said it again. And I said, well, maybe instead of obsessing about the magnitude of traditional participation, maybe you need to measure something that's different. Because it looks like that the expression of this faith community has really transformed over the last 20 or 30 years. I said, I don't know many congregations that have to replace the hinges on the front door. Now, this lady was, oh my gosh, she was sharp. She was engaging. She had a lot of the good kind of charisma. And they were able to sort of redefine themselves, not just to the people outside the walls. I think the people outside the walls already got it because they were coming in, they were wearing out the hinges. In that case, it was the leaders inside the walls who perhaps needed to rethink how they saw themselves and what the markers of success would be. So I have a new grandson. He's fabulous. And I was showing a picture to a colleague of mine 2 weeks ago. And the colleague said, and it was a picture of me holding Sam, and it was taken from kind of back there. And my colleague said, "Oh, is that the other grandfather?" And I was like, "No, that's me. That's Paul." And she said, "Wow, I didn't realize from the back just how gray your hair is." I'm not saying that was the highlight of my day, but here's somebody that's known me for a long time, and they don't think of the back of my head being gray. And sometimes we have to, whether it's a volunteer role or a corporate role or a church or civic role, we have to acknowledge that things are a little bit different than perhaps we wish or the way we remember. And in the case of that wonderful worshiping community, they were doing fabulous things, but they were keeping score based on a model that just didn't hold anymore. And that had direct impact on how they received monies and how they deployed monies.
I think that is not just a church thing. This is a universal, and we get stuck in thinking that the things that we know and we're most comfortable with will always remain that way, and we don't realize what is required to sustain things past their shelf life, so to speak.
Right.
Yeah, it's
well, and you see this in business. You see decisions that are made that might make sense for the enterprise, but that might not resonate at all with the consumer public. I mean, in the last 24 hours, Amazon has decided that Prime membership, you can only ship to one address. Oh, I can tell you, you lost the Griers because sometimes things are shipped to the house and sometimes things are shipped to the office. And my hunch, in 2 weeks, we'll know whether or not this turned out. My hunch is you're going to see a big pushback from the buying public. And the ability to lead in those kinds of really complicated situations. I mean, how many times have we seen corporate leaders fall flat on their faces? Most of your viewers probably aren't old enough to remember New Coke. Ed, you and I can remember New Coke.
Yeah.
586, something like that.
I was living in Atlanta when that came out.
Yep. I was working at a hospital. The Coke people put New Coke in the vending machines. You would have thought it was the beginning of the next world. Yeah. Now, Coke made a good decision in that they backed away from it. But, you know, those kinds of leadership challenges, doesn't matter whether it's a taxable or tax exempt organization, doesn't matter if it's manufacturing or what have you, that knowing the reality of context is critical and listening to what the customers are saying.
And helping them listen to each other.
Right.
Major part of that. That's what I also found is that you have strong voices and they come in and they have their opinion and they're not going to listen to anyone else because they've already decided their perspective is the ruling perspective. And if you actually listen to what they're saying, it's very self-serving and it will never work. So
I told Susan last night, I had to run a couple of errands yesterday, and I went by a Church's Chicken, and I didn't realize that Church's Chicken has a new style for its restaurants, and I didn't know they have a new logo. I missed that somehow. Of course, in the last 10 days, there's been this huge national outcry about another restaurant chain that changed its logo.
Yeah.
And people took offense. And of course, the thing I want to know is, was it the customers taking offense? Or as the old saying goes, was it the folks sitting in the cheap seats who don't have a particular allegiance? In church life, we see this all the time. If a church wants to do a renovation, if a church wants to sell some of its property, and I used to do a lot of work on church real estate, the loudest voices tend to be the folks outside who aren't part of the community, aren't part of the catchment area, but who like the idea of the way it used to be or the way it is today. And so, yeah, you're absolutely right. Those different voices frequently aren't talking to each other. Sometimes they're yelling at each other, but they're certainly not listening to each other in many cases.
What I find is that the nature of the culture we exist in, particularly social media,
Well,
caters to people's opinions rather than to their actions.
right.
And um, and so me, and I've been talking about impact for 3 decades. But if you listen to people who are in the social media world, they talk about influence.
Right.
And how do you measure influence? Well, I have this many viewers.
Mhm.
What does that mean? What does that translate into in terms of change? Well, they can't measure that. And I think this is one of those kind of archetypal things that defines the modern world, which is that we're all about change until we have to change. And we're going to talk about it. We're going to talk about it, but we're not going to do anything about it. And as a result, we find ourselves back against the wall and with not many options of what to do. And so, yeah, it's really interesting.
One of the things that I have found interesting, and it doesn't matter whether you're talking about the market segment for a given business or a community organization or a church organization, most leaders have access to the demographics, the psychographics of who their key audience is. And I was on a panel last year, and Presbyterians, as a general rule, are well-educated, relatively prosperous folks, kind of like the Episcopalians. So the Episcopalians have better wine, but never mind. But I was on this panel, and someone asked the question, and they were talking about their own hometown. They asked the question of, why is it that Presbyterians move so slowly? And in this case, it was an evangelical congregation that was doing great things and moving really, really, really quickly. And the question was more complex than that. That's basically what it boiled down to. And I finally said, well, the thing about it, and this guy was Presbyterian. I said, the thing about it is, Presbyterians tend to be fine with change as long as that change impacts someone else. Where we don't tend to do as well is when that change affects us.
Yeah.
I'm perfectly happy to recommend changes that affect Ed, but not Paul. And a lot of times I think we take for granted that our target audience is open to something that, if we were really honest with ourselves, we might not be open to. And getting folks to talk to each other who are invested in the success and the impact of the enterprise to make sure that the leaders have an accurate read on that this is what the audience is looking for, or this is what the audience might be using different language, but this is what the audience is saying. And of course, the hardest part is ignoring all the noise from the folks who have very strongly held opinions, but aren't really in our target population or aren't affected in the first place. That's really hard to do, particularly with social media, because the noise can just be overwhelming.
As you were working with all these churches over the last couple of decades,
Mhm.
there were major disruptions in society, like the recession in the 2000s and COVID. What was your experience of watching how churches responded to those situations?
So the CEO of the foundation is a fabulous guy. His name is Tom Taylor. Great guy, great friend. Tom said early into COVID, Tom's a pretty introverted guy. He said, I've been preparing for this my entire life. Working from home was a godsend for him. When we look at these radical changes, I think personality really comes into it. If everybody's going to work in an office and everybody's dressed pretty much the same, and you do this 5 days a week and you do it for years and years and years, you can kind of predict how other people are going to react. But when the landscape changes underneath you, whether it was 9/11, whether it was the recession, and at least the Great Recession lasted 18 months. So you sort of had time to, start feeling the earth tremble. Whereas with COVID, I was sitting in a barbecue place in Charlotte, North Carolina, with 2 colleagues, both of whom live in Salt Lake City. And we were just enjoying good old North Carolina barbecue, and all of a sudden, their phones just blew up. They had a late afternoon flight. And we discovered pretty quickly we had to get to the airport. And they got on one of the last flights out before the airline started shutting down. You remember the airline shut down for a few days. I think personalities, what I found the most interesting was watching the extroverts and watching the introverts. In many ways, the introverts handled COVID a lot more, in a much more healthy fashion. Extroverts like me just were going nuts. I'm supposed to talk to somebody all day long over a computer screen, but I can't read body language as well. I can't pull Ed aside in the hallway and say, Ed, come on, I need your help on this. I think one of the great lessons was that we have to really know the people we work most closely with, not just in the typical construct, but we really need to know what makes them tick. We really need to know, how would they react if the whole world changed overnight in many ways, in ways that we couldn't even imagine.
Yeah.
So how did churches do? Larger churches tended to do better. Smaller churches tended to do worse. I think a lot of that has to do with leadership styles. Larger churches tend to invest more authority in their pastoral leaders. Tim Keller, who was the pastor of Redeemer Presbyterian Church in New York, said once that in large churches, decisions are made by the few and implemented by the many. But in small churches, decisions are made by the many, but implemented by the few.
Yeah.
And while that's simplifying it a lot, I think the changes that we have seen, the rush to adopt digital solutions. I mean, one of the things there's been a lot of study about this. Congregations that had online giving before COVID tended to do much better than those congregations that didn't, and some still don't have digital capacity. And if the doors are locked, and if you're functioning on a digital platform and you don't have the way for your constituents to support you financially using those same kinds of platforms, sooner or later, you're going to probably run out of money. And we saw a lot of congregations that did that.
I found that people in general were much more adaptive than I expected them to be.
Mhm.
And which was encouraging to me. And I was living in Wyoming when all this happened, and I was
Right.
serving on the committee on ministry for the Presbyterian of Wyoming.
And
And
you folks had social distancing down pat. I mean, let's face it, Wyoming's got a lot of space.
except when you're at church,
Exactly.
and I mean all these churches are small churches, and because all
Right.
the towns are small, uh, and so it was interesting dealing with some of them and for part of that year, one of those first 2 years, I think the first year I was the moderator of the committee on ministry, and then the last year I was out there, I was the I spent 2 years as a moderator. So I spent about 3 years out of the six that I lived out there as the moderator of the committee on ministry, which for our audience is the committee of the Presbyterian, which is a regional body of churches, and is managing the relationship between pastors and churches. And we help churches find pastors, and we help pastors get settled, and we were kind of a consultant to them. But we also have a right of saying this is not a good thing. We're not going to approve. So we have that kind of. And one of the churches had an interim. Well, he was a local pastor, but he was interim, and he was in his mid 80s, and his response to COVID was deathly serious, and he felt like his life was under threat, and I respect that. But it meant that his leadership of the church kind of vanished because he was so concerned about his own health. And so the church began to search the community for people who could be their pastor or who could at least come preach. And they found one guy who he had no credentials, but it's this thing where the many make the decisions and the few have to implement. And what we had to do was essentially say, this is not going to work and we're not going to allow it to happen. We're going to have to find someone else. And they didn't like that because they knew this guy and they liked this guy because he was a friend, he was a neighbor. But they didn't have any clue as to what his theological orientation was, what his background in biblical studies was, whether he'd ever had a seminary course. We knew that he wasn't Presbyterian at all, so he had no understanding of polity. I mean, so all these things which to the structure of the church is important was not important to the people because this is their friend and he could be their pastor.
Right.
And that, it all worked out, ultimately. And one of the things that happened was these small churches began to do Zoom services. They would broadcast their church services over Zoom. And in one of the churches, I'm trying to remember in one of the churches, their quote membership, meaning the people who showed up for church and the people who watched, expanded beyond what they had ever had as membership. Because there were all these people who were scattered across the United States for whom this was their home church. This is the church they grew up in. Oh, so we're going to go to church and see, see Aunt Felicia there, and Aunt George, Uncle George, and we're gonna see the back of their head. They see their gray hair, and you know, and it was really fascinating. And some of these churches were really good at persuading these people to donate money to the church. And I think that is a sign that okay, the church has some fluidity to it, can change and is flexible, and we just need more crises to cause it to happen.
Well, in my business career, I had a mentor who always said, never let a good crisis go to waste.
Right.
Make the changes that you need to make, but that you were scared to make. In the COVID realm, as much as we talk about how people are resistant to change, and I think most of us are, when we have to, if you look at the difference, and remember, it's been 5.5 years since COVID hit.
Yeah.
March of 2020. This is September of 2025. I can remember the Maundy Thursday service at an Anglican church in Greenville, South Carolina, where the way it was broadcast was on Facebook Live, which I didn't even know existed the week before. And the priest was carrying around his cell phone. Well, the Anglicans, they do some high church kind of stuff. And you could see the smoke of the incense. And when he would turn, the phone would go all over the place. And we're like, okay, this is okay. We can't be there in person. But 45 days later, everybody's got this new level of sophistication. And then 6 months later, there's this new level of sophistication. When we have to, we really can adapt. We really can make changes. Did it make everybody happy? No. Did people fight about whether we should gather or whether we should stay apart? My favorite story about that is the pastor who told me they were very, very upset with one of their lay leaders. This pastor believed that gathered worship was unsafe. This lay leader believed that with appropriate precautions, gathered worship was completely safe. That you really didn't have to do away with all the bulletins, because this lay leader was pretty sure that the COVID germs were not riding on the tops of paper bulletins. And I'm listening to this pastor and trying to appreciate their concern and their frustration, because I've heard the same thing 40 times that day. And then the pastor said that what surprised them the most was how a physician, an epidemiologist, could have such completely incorrect opinions. And I just had to say, well, wait a minute. You went straight from college to seminary. You've been in parish ministry your entire career, and you're arguing with a medical professional, somebody who specializes in this kind of stuff, about what's right and what's wrong. And they said, well, yeah. I said, well, how do you know? Because I watch the news all day.
Yeah.
And that's what we were dealing with. But when we have to, we can improvise. My father-in-law died in January of 2021. I got COVID. And so at a graveside, with the family physically separate from each other, my son had the smart idea of FaceTiming me right before the graveside service began. And I was able to participate, not in the sorry about the plane, the windows are open. Not in the way I wanted to, but in a way that worked, given the circumstances.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I would have thought of that myself. I think it took my son thinking of that. And then, of course, there's the, okay, well, if you're willing to do this differently, Are you willing to do that differently? Or are you willing to do something differently even when there's not a crisis at hand?
Yeah.
And that's when leadership really, really does test our limits.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing how these situations disrupt the normal patterns of people, and leadership can intensify the disruption, like what they had in California when COVID, and they
Right.
they closed down churches, and they closed down, but they didn't close down the strip clubs, but they closed down the churches.
Well, I mean, you got to keep your priorities straight. I mean, come on.
And a friend of mine who knows this pastor was telling me about what this pastor did. And this pastor had been a member of the city council and had been at one point the mayor of this town, of the town where he's the pastor of the church. And he was on the city council. And when COVID hit, and these orders were given, he resigned from the city council, and he says, "I'm just going to take care of my church." He says, "And we're not going to follow the state mandates. We're going to remain open. This was a faith statement. We're going to trust that people will act responsibly. If they have any sense of being ill, they're not coming to church." But what happened was, because they were showing up in church every Sunday, they had people who had no connection to the church. They had atheists and ultra liberals and Democrats coming to this conservative evangelical church looking for fellowship and for human community. And I think if leaders were to place that as a high priority, if not the highest priority, of how are we going to relate to one another in whatever situation we're in, that they will begin to make the right decisions all the time about what is in the best interest of their people.
No. Easily said, not always easily done.
That's right.
But
Of course.
You're right on target on that.
So
Yeah.
my last question is, so you've been in the philanthropic world for a long time.
Mhm.
What is your sense of where it's going to move into the future, particularly as the U.S. government has changed a lot of its own support for philanthropic things? What do you see happening, as it's just another disruption, but what do you see happening in the future as far as philanthropies and giving and that sort of thing? That
Well, I think if you go back to 2018, when the tax laws were changed really, really significantly, where the standard deduction increased and where itemizing for charitable deductions went away for the vast majority of American taxpayers, people were wringing their hands saying all the charities are going to go broke. Well, that didn't happen. In fact, giving has increased. Now, some will say, and there's probably something to it, that COVID, particularly early on, when you see this screaming need, people who are inclined to give will probably give more when they see the need increase. And that was certainly the case with COVID. But I think one of the key takeaways is people continue to give. They might have given differently. So sure, there are some donors, particularly at the higher levels, who will itemize every other year, take the standard deduction every other year, and sort of, collect their giving into the even numbered years. People are going to always adapt to changes in tax law. But I think the bigger question is, how do charities of all types, whether they're religious, whether they're secular, whether it's social justice, whether it's concern for the climate, whether it's concern for the whales, whatever it is, I think charities are going to have to do a better job of communicating the impact of what they do and the value proposition of why this charity can do a better job than someone else. I think the days of taking donors for granted are quickly coming to an end. If you look at generational giving theory, My dad, he was still living, he would be 104. He gave out of a sense of duty. He trusted institutions.
Mm-hmm.
His children probably don't trust institutions as much as he did, probably don't give out of a sense of duty. Their giving is probably more reacting to how they see the world needs to change, how they perceive the world needs to change. So I think that the challenge for charitable organizations is to know their donors, is to communicate. I mean, you think about colleges and universities. Where I had something right here. My son went to Georgia Tech. We give money to Georgia Tech, and Lord knows it's not because of the football performance, most seasons. But if you look at their materials are college kids. What a surprise. And what they're doing is they're reminding those of us that went to college of for most of us, what a terrific experience, a transformative experience. And Georgia Tech is sending the message that with your financial support, we can help change the world through a first-class, often engineering education for a new generation of leaders. I think the charities that are unable to communicate that impact, that are unable to touch that point within their donors and their grantors, I think those charities are going to struggle, because at its core, giving is a completely irrational action. Why should I give my hard-earned money to Ed? That's illogical. I think in many ways, giving is a values-based and an emotional decision based on how we perceive the recipient to faithfully use resources that we are entrusting them. I think the days of just assuming that because Ed gave $1,000 a year to fill in the name of the blank, the charity, to just assume that that's going to continue will prove to be unwise. But when I look around at some of the organizations, religious, non-religious, civic, arts, humanities, you name it, when I look at the work that some of these organizations are doing, it is genuinely inspiring. So I'll wrap up with this. Ed, do you remember when we used to watch the Olympics on television? Not online, but we watched on television. They broadcast the opening ceremony.
Right.
And at one point, usually after the athletes would march in, they would cut to a commercial. And in the United States, that commercial was from the United States Olympic Organizing Committee. And they would ask for your philanthropic support for tomorrow's athletes. And they got this incredible response because they had stirred something that went beyond simply the intellectual.
Mm-hmm.
They whether it's patriotism, whether it's love of sports, whether it's love of young people, whether it's competitiveness, those folks found a way to show you something you care about and then show you a way to provide financial support. The story goes that AT&T would have advance notice of when those commercials would air because the taxation on the telephone system infrastructure way back when was such that AT&T had to be ready for them. Not all of us have the Olympics, but all of us have the ability to try to stir a positive reaction from our constituencies.
I agree with you on that. I see that. And one of the things that I saw when I started my consulting practice 30 years ago, um, we were living in Western North Carolina, and one of the things I discovered when I got there was, I mean, these are not large cities at all,
Right.
but there were like 300 nonprofits operating there. And I realized, as I began to meet, live in that world, was a lot of these nonprofits were vanity organizations. I have a passion for, kittens, and so I'm going to start a kittens nonprofit. And but I think it's more difficult now to do something that's oriented around one's own vanity and one's own purpose, and you have to communicate some larger value, and you really do have to communicate what is the impact that I want to have. And impact is some kind of change, and if you can't define what that change looks like, I mean, support is not change. So it's a very interesting time that we're living in, and I guess you're glad to have retired from that. But my guess is that you're going to keep your eye and your ear to the ground for a long time, still going forward.
Yeah, check with me next week. I'll have different opinions next week. I'm trying to figure out what that does look like. It is an exciting time. We in the United States have an economy that is not always fair, but it's strong and it's resilient. And we have folks who are generous, who care about lots of different things. And to the extent that those of us that are in the biz are able to communicate with that group of people and introduce ourselves to new groups of people, I think there's a lot of excitement in the days ahead. And yeah, there's a part of me that I'm not so sure about sitting in the stands. I might want to get back out on the field. Not sure about that. But it's only 3 days, so
Well, maybe there's a board membership out there waiting for you to take on, and you focus on one organization instead of many, and your expertise gets applied to a situation where you can really see your impact. And there's nothing better to be able to see when you're retired than to see I'm still making a difference. It's really important.
yeah. And that's what I'm striving for.
Well,
It's
Paul,
been great chatting with you. Great catching up with you.
great.
Best of wishes to your son and daughter-in-law and the whole fam.
Yeah,
And
to you and your grandson and your new grandson and all. And we'll certainly talk again.
I'll
So
look forward to that.
thank
Yeah,
you.
thanks so much.
And we'll see you next time here on the Eddie Network podcast. Bye bye.
All right.